Good evening, everyone. It's time for us to begin. It's good to see all these boys and girls coming in with smiling faces tonight. Maybe school's going okay so far. No, it's been a very different week for you than what you're used to, but we continue to think about you, and we're praying for you that things will continue to go smoothly for you through this school year. I know you're not. Some of you may not be expecting me to see me here tonight. I was supposed to be in Dover, Tennessee tonight to speak on the summer series at the Dover Church of Christ, where Bobby Odell preaches. But I got a call earlier this week, and they've had a couple of cases of COVID in that congregation, so they decided to go to online services. So I ended up recording my lesson for tonight and sending it to them so that they could use that on social media tonight. So I'm very excited. I finally get a chance, or one of the rare chances I get, to actually listen to my friend Will Norrid speak. And I'm really looking forward to that. He'll be bringing us a message here in just a little bit. Thankful for him for doing that for us tonight. Don't have much in the way of announcements, and just want to continue to remember all of those that we have listed on our prayer list this week. And if you know of any updates or changes we need to make, please be sure to let us know about that. Tonight our opening prayer will be led by Stanley Childress, and our songs will be led by Dakota Betts. And Keith Jones, would you lead us in our closing prayer tonight? Keith Jones will have our closing prayer. All right, so at this time, let's all join in together.
Number 637. 637.
kind and righteous, loving Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day. Thankful we can come back here tonight, study thy word, and worship thee in spirit and truth. Thankful for Brother Grant, the good job he does here with us. To be with Brother Will, he brings the message tonight. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for good health. Ask thy blessings on the sick, the afflicted, the bereaved, anyone that's struggling or suffering tonight. We're thankful for this country where we have the privilege to worship without persecution. Pray that this will always be so. We pray for this country, the turmoil that's going on right now. We pray that something can be done to alleviate that. Lord, we're thankful for Jesus, for the life he lived, and the sacrifice that he made on the cross. We might have eternal life someday if we're found faithful. We're about to go through the remainder of this service. Bless, look down on us, bless each one of us, forgive us our sins. Bless these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good evening. Clint warned me that this was a new unit and maybe a little bit more powerful, so I wanted to be careful in putting it on. I've told Brent and Clint before, out at Lebanon where I preach on Sundays, no internet, no microphone, no landline. So if you're out there for the duration. And but always good to come to town, so to speak, and be able to be with you tonight. I have been benefited from this study over the last several weeks with Brent teaching from Hebrews chapter 11, and that is where we are going to be tonight in Hebrews chapter 11. And we're going to be talking about Moses, and we're going to be talking particularly about part 2 of Moses. 2 or 3 weeks ago, when Brent mentioned to me that this might be a possibility, and he was telling which section might fall on which night and so forth when he was going to be gone, and all of Moses was at that point one section. And I said, Brent, don't you think we ought to break that down? I mean, Moses is mentioned 800 times in the Scriptures and 80 times in the New Testament. Don't you think we ought to give him 2 nights? And Brent said, no, you'll be fine. And then when Brent found out he had to do part of it, he was like, let's break it into 2 parts. It'll go better that way. So if you were here last week, you heard Brent begin there in Hebrews chapter 11 with verse 23. And he talked about the first 3 or 4 verses there down through verse 26. So verses 23 through 26, Brent covered last week. And that really covered proportionally very little of Moses' life. It actually only talked about his infancy and then his growth in Pharaoh's house, and then eventually, and Brent ended last week with the idea that he defended his countrymen, and then at that point he was driven out or fled, depending on which way you want to look at it, and that's where we will be picking up tonight. As you know, those of you who have been here previously for this study, we've been talking about Hebrews chapter 11, which is, in kind of the common parlance, the Hall of Fame of Faith. And it talks about men and women of faith from the Old Testament. And it's being taught or written to or eventually read aloud to or preached to, however you want to think about it, to Christians. Primarily, you can guess, based on the name, Jewish Christians. And they seem to be, if you look through the whole book, involved in sort of a struggle. They have come out from what they had been believing before, and what they had been practicing before, and they had become followers of Jesus, which to them, Jesus was the fulfillment of all those Old Testament prophecies. He was the promised Messiah, and they had trusted in that, and they have become Christians. They had become followers of Jesus. But now there is pressure, probably from not only the religious leaders, but potentially from family members, from friends, from other sources, to kind of draw them back into those things like sacrifice and those things like keeping the Sabbath. And it's very interesting when you study the New Testament, particularly the book of Acts, that it was not an immediate break with Judaism. Christianity, as we understand it, New Testament Christianity, the first gospel sermon there that we've studied many times before on the day of Pentecost, it was definitely a new movement, but it took some time to give up some of those things like visiting the temple, some of those dietary restrictions that they were so familiar with. It wasn't like one day they were observing all that stuff, and the next day they were like, "Man, that's not what we need to do. We're going to go in a totally different direction." It took place in stages, as it often does with people today. When we study the gospel with our friends and neighbors, they may first start out attending services with us. They may engage in a personal Bible study with us, but it takes some time for them to eventually, Lord willing, accept the things that they need to accept and take those steps. One thing that I want to mention about Hebrews chapter 11 in particular, and I made reference to this, I think, a little bit when I spoke about Jacob when Brent was away earlier in the summer. But Hebrews chapter 11 is not intended to be an impartial biography of Old Testament figures. It's not intended to tell the whole story. It's not intended to be something that's like, well, he had these good qualities and these bad qualities, and we just need to balance them all out. And we have the Old Testament for that, right? Moses, who we're going to speak about specifically tonight, had lots of flaws that are talked about in the pages of the Old Testament. A lot of Moses' flaws are talked about in the pages of the Old Testament that he wrote. He wrote about the excuses that he made at the burning bush. He wrote about his disobedience in not being willing to speak to the rock when he struck the rock when God had told him to speak to the rock over in Numbers. And something that Brent has mentioned again and again, and I want to mention this at the beginning tonight, and I think we'll hit it at the end as well, that these accounts are a witness to the fact that we are not judged as Christians, as believers, as people of faith, by our worst moments. We have a tendency, right, when we look at a person's life and we see some of the choices that they've made, let's be honest, when we look at our own lives and see some of the choices that we made, sometimes the things that stand out to us are bad things, the wrong decisions, the wrong turns that we have taken. Even though we may have been forgiven, even though many other people may have let that go, we have a tendency to focus on those things. Scripture does that too to some degree in the long sections that we talk about in the Old Testament. Moses is mentioned, as I referenced a while ago, 800 times in the Bible. And so it tells the full story. But tonight, we want to talk about the selective history that the Hebrew writer gives us. And the reason the Hebrew writer is giving us this history, not just of Moses, but of all the men and women that are found here, is for the purpose of building faith. For the purpose of being able to say, you who are struggling in your faith, you who are about to give up in your faith, remember Abel. Remember Noah. Remember Abraham. Remember Rahab. Remember these men and women who went through hard times, just like you were experiencing, but they were able to ultimately keep the faith. And so that is the purpose that the Hebrew writer has. Some people might say, well, it's not the whole truth. It's not a balanced account. That's not the point. The balanced account is given. Stephen gives a little bit of that in Acts chapter 7 when he spends several verses talking about Moses and his good points, high points, and low points. But this particular purpose, written by this particular writer to this particular group of people at this particular time, is to encourage them. I think there's a lesson in that even before we look at the text. That when somebody is struggling, like these Hebrew Christians were struggling, that is a time to bring encouragement. That is a time to point them to people who have kept the faith. That's not a time to say, you remember old Uncle John, he was just like you, sorry as they come. That's not the method that he takes, right? He says, remember these heroes and heroines of the faith. I do want to read briefly just those 4 verses in the lead-in that Brent shared with us last week to give us a little bit of the idea. Some of us love sports, or we love maybe music and listening to albums or watching movies. And when you go to see a movie or after a ball game, if you're watching something like SportsCenter, they will say this is the highlight reel. And what they mean is we're going to hit the high points, and we're not going to tell you that in the 4th inning there was a 3-2 count in a baseball game and the guy just grounded out, nothing really happened. That's not the purpose of the highlights. It's to hit the big moments. And let's be honest, to selectively hit the big moments, to frame the story in the way that we want to. And we'll see that the Hebrew writer does that here. All right, Hebrews chapter 11, beginning with verse 23. And Brent and I are using the same version, New King James Version, so it should be just like it sounded last week, and it's pretty consistent regardless of which translation you're reading from. Beginning in verse 23 of Hebrews chapter 11, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. Honestly, Moses gets no credit for that. That was his parents' faith. Brent also mentioned last week the midwife's faith. There's a lot of faith around Moses before he ever has the capacity for faith. And don't you know that was an influence? If somebody risked their life, multiple somebodies risked their life just to keep you alive, don't you know that would give you a feeling of calling and a feeling of assurance that God had something intended for you? And continuing in verse 24, it says, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. I love the old King James right there that talks about the pleasures of sin for a season. Seasonal pleasures of sin. The idea that they are ever-changing, they are not permanent, that they will indeed fade away. And then the idea in verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ, that is the backlash, if you will, that he's going to receive for being a follower of the Old Testament God who will become the New Testament Christ. He esteemed that greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. What that tells you, just to summarize real briefly before we move into these 3 adult experiences of Moses. When we read the account in Exodus, and you can see this, what was just read unfolds in Exodus chapter 1 and Exodus chapter 2, you see that Moses did not have this figured out at 14. You know, sometimes I think when we say someone came of age, and we talk about baptism and the age of accountability and those ideas, we acknowledge, hopefully, I think we should, that those are different for every person depending on their circumstance and their maturity level and the amount of knowledge that they have and so forth and so on. But Moses was 40. And I'm not saying that should be the age of accountability, but it shows that it took him a while to figure out that he was going to go out, as Stephen mentions in Acts chapter 7, and look upon the affliction of his brethren and choose to do something about it. It's not like he was 10 and was like, there's a lot of injustice in the world, and it needs to be seen about. Was that thought developing? Possibly. We know Jochebed, Brent mentioned this last week, Jochebed, his own mother, was his nurse, and not just in a medical sense, not primarily in a medical sense, but his nanny. She raised him up, and no doubt that helped him with several things, to have a sense of where he came from originally. Wonder how he knew how to speak Hebrew. I mean, if he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter at age 3 months, somehow he learned to speak and communicate with his own people. How did he know they were his own people? Unless Jochebed or someone in the royal household had informed him of that. And so over the years, and again, and Brent admitted this to us last week, and I admit it to you again tonight, a lot of this is supposition. There's a lot of silent years. The Bible loves to say, and after 40 years. And you're like, 40 years? Like that's half a lifetime in our modern, in our modern sense of thinking. But we know that however he learned it, that he had a moral obligation to go out and to speak up and to defend his fellow Israelites and to try to improve the situation for them. We mentioned selective history, and I think it's also important that we mention gradual revelation. Remember, Moses wrote, historically, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. There's no Scripture. Not a word of Scripture at this time. So it's not like Moses was reading along and said, oh, at this point I'm supposed to rise up and liberate my kinfolks. That's not how it was. But instead, he had this drive and this push that was moving him forward. And ultimately, as we know in Exodus chapter 3, much, much more is going to be revealed to him. I want to take verses 27, 28, 29, one by one. I'm going to read through them, and then we'll come back and pick them up one by one and hopefully make some application for us today. Verse 27. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Remember that. We're going to come back to it in just a moment. For he endured as seeing him who was invisible. And by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they, verse 29, passed through the Red Sea by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. You notice something immediately, is that really only one of those verses, in the purest sense, is about Moses himself, personally. And that's the first one in verse 27. The idea that he forsook Egypt. The other two are going to be about the people, and then ultimately about the nation that's going to come to be formed, that Moses will, of course, be the earthly leader of. Now, Exodus chapter 2 and verse 14 tells us that after Moses had seen, and Brent mentioned this last week, had seen the Egyptian taskmaster doing wrong, mistreating an Israelite slave, potentially mistreating him to the point of death. There would have been no ramifications for that. The Israelites were property, and it seems from the way that the text is written, they were sort of Egyptian communal property, that every Israelite was subject to every Egyptian. At least that's the way it seems to be described in the first 2 chapters of Exodus. And it says he saw the Egyptian beating a Hebrew, he slew the Egyptian, he killed the Egyptian, buried his body in the sand, which to me speaks of at least caution, if not fear. And then the next day, he goes out and he sees 2 Israelites who are fighting in the field, and he tries to break them up. He tries to separate them. And they basically say, you don't have any right to tell us what to do because we know what you did. You act like you're an Egyptian, but we know how you really feel. You killed an Egyptian yesterday. It says in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 14 that Moses feared. This thing is known, and he feared, and so he left the land of Egypt. It's interesting when you look there at verse 27 in Hebrews chapter 11, when it says, "By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he saw who was invisible." In other words, he looked to God's approval rather than to the approval of the king. And if you're like me, when you first read that, you think, that seems sort of inconsistent. He was afraid that he's going to be prosecuted or killed, put to death, and so he runs away. And yet this passage in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 27 says he was not afraid of King. That is the standard interpretation, and I think that you can make the argument about fear and respect and that sort of thing. But what if, just to think about for a moment, he had already disobeyed the king's command? You think Pharaoh was saying, like, Moses, it's about time you learned that you're supposed to liberate these people? That you need to go out and look upon your brethren and decide what you're going to do about it, Moses? Probably not, right? I mean, Pharaoh, all we know about Pharaoh, both grandfather Pharaoh and potentially, father, I guess, adopted father and or adopted brother, the Pharaohs are not big on giving up slaves, on giving up servants, on letting people have their own way. And so I think there is a potential there, and we see this carried out with the 10 plagues, that Pharaoh is very unwilling, the Pharaoh at that time at least, is very unwilling to let the people go. Of Yul Brynner fame. Pharaoh is very unwilling to let the people go. And so it could be, and this is just a possibility, not necessarily a necessity, but a possibility, that having any concern for his brother Israelites was already something that was going against what the king would have him to do. And I think there's a need to at least consider that possibility, because it is natural, if you are a wanted man, if you are a hunted man, and you flee and you stay away for 40 years, and apparently we're not thinking about going back until you had, this theophany, this experience at the burning bush, that there's more to it than just, we got in a disagreement, I can sort this out, I know I'll be forgiven. This was a change in his life. And one reason I think we can appreciate that a little bit more, and Brent read this passage to us last week, and I've referenced it a couple of times already, is in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen, giving his speech before the Jewish council in Jerusalem, he talks about, he believed, speaking of Moses, he believed that his brethren would realize what he was trying to do. But they did not. So Moses goes out. He's standing up, looking over the fields, looking over the brick kilns, looking over the places where the Israelites are working. And he realizes that he has a responsibility to try to do right by his people. And the minute that he tries to do that, in his own strength, in his own power, in his own physical strength, right? Killing the Egyptian taskmaster, not only do the Israelites not realize it, they threaten to turn him in. And so I think, we read that story in Exodus chapter 2 and we kind of just brush past it and we say, this is how he got to Midian. This is how he got to the wilderness. But it could be, and I think it stands to reason, that there's more to that story than we perhaps have traditionally thought. And so what that story initiates is the personal exodus of Moses. Moses leaves Egypt. He flees Egypt. He runs away. And he spends the next 40 years, he's 40 at the time, according to the Scripture. He spends the next 40 years in Midian being a shepherd. Anybody ever noticed a theme of shepherds in the Bible? They're everywhere, right? All the way from righteous Abel, all the way, to the good shepherd at the end of our Christian journey that will bring us home to heaven. And so he's there, and although he seems to have given up on that plan to liberate the Israelites, God has not forgotten Moses. God did not spend that 40 years of his childhood and young adulthood in preparation, nor the 40 years in the school of the wilderness in order to just let Moses die in obscurity in Midian. That idea of the school of the wilderness, Abraham, David, Elijah, Hagar, Ruth, people that had experiences of being strangers in a strange land. People who had experiences of being driven out, whether by God or whether by forces of negative forces that eventually God would use for good. Talked about Joseph recently. Brent taught on Joseph. Again, that idea of being homeless, being a sojourner, is very present in Moses' life. Now you will notice something between verse 27 and verse 28 in Hebrews chapter 11. There's a lot of stuff that's not mentioned. A lot of really important stuff, right? Like the burning bush, not mentioned at all. The plagues, except for the last one, not mentioned at all. Aaron not mentioned. Miriam not mentioned. Just seems like there's a huge gap in what the Hebrew writer could have included. But if you think about it, if you were focusing on the faith of Moses, not necessarily every one of those events, important as though they were positive for Moses. I preached a lesson, I'm sure Brent has, others of you that have taught over the years. If you look at Exodus 3 and 4, Moses makes at least 5, 6 if you count it slightly differently, excuses as to why he is not the person to go back to Egypt and liberate the Israelites. And so, the Hebrew writer doesn't say, by faith Moses made a lot of excuses. Tried to get out of doing what God had called him to do. Again, it's selective history. The people reading this, they knew those stories. They weren't unfamiliar with the Old Testament. Okay, they were more familiar with the Old Testament probably than any group of Christians that were written to in the New Testament, given their background. But that incident is left out. Even though it was, this great moment where God revealed himself, where he gave his covenant name to Moses, he says, I was known to Abraham, I was known to Isaac, I was known to Jacob, but by my name, God is the Lord, and we know the Hebrew equivalent, I was not known to them. And it's this beautiful moment, but it's not a perfect moment for Moses. Moses even has a scene in there where he runs from a snake. Which, by the way, is a totally legitimate thing to do. But the snake was his staff, right? He throws down his staff, it becomes a snake, and he flees before it. Perfectly natural response. But you wouldn't mention that at somebody's funeral. That wouldn't be a highlight unless you were trying to be humorous. And so the Hebrew writer conveniently leaves that out. Leaves out the plagues, as I mentioned. But apparently, in the course of those events, Moses' dream, or at least Moses' realization of God's dream for him, is that he must go back and lead the people. And indeed, he does do that. It's interesting to note, and I think if we don't read the Old Testament in particular with the idea that God has a sense of irony and that God has a sense of humor, we miss out on some valuable lessons there. But the idea that Moses has been wandering around in Midian for 40 years, and now I've got to go back and lead the people. And where are we going to go? We're going to go right through here and go to the Promised Land. We're going to go right through this general area, this wilderness where you have been, knowing where all the water holes are, knowing where all the things are. We're going to go right on this path back to the Promised Land. I think it's interesting when we consider the idea that it is so much easier for someone to say, follow me, than to say, let me tell you how to get there. Some of y'all have visited Lebanon over the years. I've been out there 16 years, I guess, and been in this area that length of time, known many of you for longer than that even. And I can tell you how to get there. You get out here on the highway and you go to Dresden and you go past, the first four-way stop to the next four, and the red light, and at the fork you go this way and you go 4 miles, and then you turn to the right, but not till you get to the sign. You got that, right? That's pretty accurate. How much easier is it to say, Anne-Marie and I are going to go get out in the car, and y'all can just follow us out there. We're having a fellowship meal. Lord willing, we'll be doing those again soon. We're having a singing tonight, and after services tonight, anybody that wants to go with us, just follow us out there. So much easier. And this is in a really small area that most of us are probably really familiar with, but yet we know that it's easier to follow someone than to take direction. And so when Moses goes back and calls the people forth, he doesn't have to say, we're just going out into the middle of nowhere. He can say, no, I've been to the other side. I haven't been all the way to the promised land yet, but I know the direction that we need to go. And so Moses' personal exodus leads to ultimately the exodus of the children of Israel. Now in verse 28, I want to mention these two verses briefly. He talks about, the Hebrew writer talks about that by faith he, that is Moses, and you could say they, he's going to use they in the next verse, kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. We are familiar probably, again, with the Ten Commandments, that the 9 commandments fell in order, and it could be argued, I think, very successfully that they fell in order of severity. There were some very inconvenient plagues, and they just gradually got worse and worse and worse, with the crops being destroyed, the animals dying, so forth and so on. Bugs, frogs, gnats, bulls, none of it was great. And the last plague is what's mentioned here. Because the last plague did affect only the Egyptians and the death of the firstborn, but it only did not affect, and I hope I don't confuse that, it only did not affect the Israelites because of their willingness to be faithful to what God had commanded them to do. You will notice the previous 9 plagues, they all happened, but the Israelites did not have to do anything. They affected the Egyptians only, but the Israelites were not having to avoid them per se. The 10th plague is different, and this idea of Passover is this imagery, and it's actually just a very equivalent word. This idea that the death angel that killed the firstborn of all Egypt, the firstborn of the king that was on the throne and the prisoner that was in the dungeon. It would be a beautiful passage if it wasn't so terrifying. It spared the Israelites. And they were given explicit instructions in Exodus chapter 12 what they should do. That they should kill the lamb, that they should use a certain kind of plant to spread the blood, that they should eat the meat in a certain way, that they should throw away the meat that was not eaten, that it should be burned with fire, that they should take all the leaven from their houses, which is where we end up having generations later, of course, unleavened bread in the Lord's Supper through Jesus' extension of that. And so they were given very specific instructions, and they kept them by faith. If you had witnessed, you speak for me, I won't speak for you. If I had witnessed the first 9 plagues, and the Lord said to Moses, this is going to be the one. He will drive you out. He will not let you go, He will not let you go, He will not let you go. But with this one, He will drive you out. And the Egyptians will be so glad to see you go, they will heap jewels upon your children. They will give you camels. They will give you donkeys. They will drive you out of Egypt. If you knew what had happened previously and how terrible all of those things were, it might have inspired faith to do exactly what God had said in regard to this plague. Now, the New Testament speaks of Christ as our Passover. Paul uses that language in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. and verse 7. There is language or parallel language with Christ in 1 Peter 1 and verse 9, Romans 3 and verse 25, Romans 5 and verse 9, Ephesians 1 and verse 7, 2 and verse 13, Colossians 1 and verse 20, on and on and on. This idea of Christ as our sacrifice, or the blood of Christ providing our Passover. And we obviously see when Jesus instituted our memorial feast in the Lord's Supper, in our communion, that, especially for the early Jewish believers, had a very close tie to their understanding of Passover, that there was bread, that unleavened bread, that showed the haste. We can't even wait to let the bread rise. It says that they ate their food with their kneading bowls upon their shoulders. You think if you had been in slavery, your people had been in slavery for 400 years, and they said, this is the night. We're leaving in the morning. I mean, you wouldn't have had to tell me to keep my shoes on. I mean, it's this, and Moses says to them, I mean, and this is, and Brent mentioned this number, at least hundreds of thousands of people who are all crammed together in this small portion of Egypt and spread out across the land. And when they hear that this is the night, it's the night. Jews, even to this day, observant Jews, when they eat the Passover, which takes place in the spring every year, it's always around Easter, but it doesn't always fall exactly at the same time. The youngest person in the room, boy or girl, gets to speak up and ask the first question. And the first question is, why is this night not like other nights? Why is this night not like other nights? And the adults respond, we were slaves once, and we are slaves no longer. And for 3,500 years, they have been doing that because this was such a significant moment. And Moses, of course, was at the center of it. I do want to mention verse 29. Verse 29, just real briefly here, to kind of round out this session on Moses. Verse 29 says, by faith they, and it's referring to the Israelites, the Hebrews, passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, or as on dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. And this is I'll say the pinnacle of the story. But this is, even though they had wavered at times, this is a true high water mark before a long 40 years of bad decisions, both, I will say, by Moses and by the people. It wasn't always just the people that complained. There were times when Moses complained as well. Moses usually complained to God because the people were complaining to him. There's a great passage. The story of the crossing of the Red Sea is found in Exodus chapter 14. And in verses 13 and 14 of that chapter, Moses, the people are saying, we're going to die. The Egyptians are following hard after us. Pharaoh's realized he can't let us go. And Moses says, stand still and behold the salvation of the Lord. I've always thought this was neat. And I certainly don't want to endorse every Hollywood interpretation of Scripture for sure. But Prince of Egypt, which many of you have seen, the animated movie that tells the life of Moses, there's a great moment at the end of that film where they are crossing the Red Sea, and it gives it visually what perhaps you might not have thought about before. But Exodus 14 describes this, the idea that on one side of the pillar of cloud, there was fog and confusion. And the Egyptians were trying to drive their horses into this fog, and they couldn't see where they were going, and so they were held back all throughout the night. And yet on the other side, it was a flame of fire. And so that the Israelites had light to go by night through the Red Sea. The Lord, of course, opens up the Red Sea. Moses holds forth his staff, and the people are... it's kind of one of those situations, this is really bad, this could be worse, but we got to do something. And they are led through the Red Sea. And you say, well, know that story? Great story. There's a lot of stuff that happens after that in the life of Moses. You're at like Exodus 14, and there's the whole rest of Exodus. There's Numbers, there's Deuteronomy, there's Leviticus. Why are none of those mentioned right here in this Hebrew Hall of Fame of faith? Well, let's be honest. There were a lot of ups and downs in the wilderness. There were a lot of good days, but a lot of setbacks. And Moses, as you remember from your previous studies, was kind of in a tug of war with the people. Let's be honest, he was kind of in a tug of war with God quite a bit of the time. God would say, I'm just going to smite these people, and Moses would intercede. And then at other times, Moses would want to, punish the people, and God would intercede. There's the scripture that describes the idea that Moses, as much as anyone has in this life, saw the fullness of the presence of God. That on Mount Sinai there were trumpets and smoke and thunder. When you're going up on a mountain, and you're the one going up, and Joshua's going up a little ways, but not near the whole ways, and you say down at the bottom, put a ring around the mountain, so that not even an animal will touch it, for it is such a holy place. And you go up there, and for 40 days, that number, of course, significant. You're there with God, and you're talking with God, and God's giving you the covenant and the laws, and you come down, and they have made an idol. Some of y'all have been real disappointed in parents or in children or in school started back. There will be disappointments, this year in school, no doubt. But I can't imagine the frustration and the disappointment that Moses must have felt. The dust of Egypt was still on their sandals. And so Moses has a little bit of a tantrum, throws down those tablets. And I mentioned that specific incident because it was repeated. Not the details per se, but the idea was repeated throughout the story in the wilderness. And so I think it's beautiful that the Hebrew writer chooses to stop kind of at the penultimate moment, the moment where Moses was most connected to God, in the sense that he was fully obeying God, and he was still yet most connected to the people. Because after that point, those two things were always in tension. Brent mentioned a few weeks ago he had mentioned it with Isaac, and we've mentioned it again with Jacob and Joseph. It's not every step along the journey that puts you in the Hall of Fame of faith, that puts you in the list of the faithful, but it's where you end up. And I would encourage you, if you get a chance, to read in Deuteronomy about where Moses ended up and about his very imperfect life, and yet a life that was lived by faith. Earlier in the book of Hebrews, Jesus is called greater than Moses. You couldn't have said anything to a Jewish person that was more controversial and more stimulating to their thinking than that. And yet, the Hebrew writer, as is his custom, says time and time again that Jesus is better than angels, better than the Abrahamic covenant, better than the Mosaic covenant, better than the Levites. Just this idea that Jesus is the ultimate expression of faith. It's interesting when you get over to Revelation, the very last book of the Bible. It talks about in Revelation chapter 15 that in heaven, the redeemed sing two things. Two verses, you might say, of a song. The song of Moses, which is found in Exodus, and the song of the Lamb. So I think that gives us a little bit of perspective as to where Moses fits in to the story of the Scripture and the story of faith. Dakota's going to come here in just a moment and lead us in number 737. Number 737. I appreciate Dakota leading singing. He's, of course, done that many times when I've been here over the years. And when I'm teaching the class in the back, he always manages to connect the songs to whatever topic is being discussed. And you might have noticed the idea of faith coming through in those first two songs that we sang tonight. One of the things that I think is key for us to remember, and James talks about this in reference to Elijah, that he was a man of, King James says, of like passions. More modern translations say he was a man just like us. I don't know if just like us is perfect, but a real human being that had real problems and real faith and real success in faithfully following after God. As you read through Hebrews chapter 11 and obviously other places in the New Testament that talk about those folks from the Old Testament that were great displays, great examples of faith, I think about all the things they didn't have. Not a one of them had a Bible. Not a one of them really had a church building. They had the temple a little bit later, but they didn't have a place, in the Old Testament at least, where they could meet like this and study from week to week. They had a very, from our perspective, kind of clunky system of sacrifice. You had to know what to offer for what thing, and you couldn't offer it yourself once the Levitical priesthood was instituted. It had to be offered by someone who was approved to offer that sacrifice. And one of the reasons I think all of that we should be aware of that and how it's helpful is that we are under such a better covenant, a fulfilled covenant. Every one of those lambs killed in the Exodus 12 Passover was looking forward to the lamb that would be killed in Jerusalem. And when we think about that and we think about the opportunity that we have to study, to grow, to encourage one another, I appreciate what Brother Stanley said in his prayer. You know, we have the freedom to meet. We have the freedom to encourage one another. We have access to all sorts of resources and information that they did not have. And yet sometimes we struggle to possess that same measure of faith. What I would encourage us to do tonight is we may be sitting here and we may be thinking, I know I need to make a change. I know I need to get out of Pharaoh's house, so to speak, and go be among my own people. Go be among the people of God. And it may be that we've never made that decision, and we need to take the Lord on tonight in confession, repenting of sin in our lives, being baptized. Or it may be that having done that sometime in the past, we've gotten off track. We've gone back to Egypt. Those Israelites, you read through Exodus, you read through Deuteronomy, you read through Numbers, and you just want to say, how do y'all keep doing this? And then I look at my own life and I say, how do you keep doing this? And yet, the possibility is not to go back to what we've known and the hardships that we've endured, but to go forward ultimately in that faith that Christ supplies. If you have a need tonight, let it be known as we stand and sing.
I must needs go home by the way of the cross. There's no other way but this. I shall never get sight of the gates of life in the way of the cross I miss. The way of the cross leads home, leads home.
kind Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for allowing us to be here in this quiet place tonight, to hear your word proclaimed. And thank you, Father, for this good man who's sent from his heart what he believes and what you have instructed us to do. Help us, Father, to be kind. Help us to be gentle with others. Help us, Father, to turn from the things that we've done that are wrong, that are sin in your sight. Help us to do better each day. Give us the opportunity, Father, as we look forward. In Jesus'